a cruel twist of fate. This isn't a tale for the faint of heart. It's a work woven with threads of pain, resilience, and brutal choices. We do not encourage dangerous shortcuts. Life is not a roll of the dice. Thousands have been lost attempting to cross the abyss. Our purpose is to tear back the veil of indifference, reveal the raw truth, and open a dialogue that echoes humanity. Safety and legality are the only path. For secure routes and reliable information, please scan the QR code on screen or find the link in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. What if the urge to escape wasn't an act of defiance, but a primal instinct not to be buried alive? What if a young woman had to choose between wasting away in her own hell or giving birth to hope itself under the icy gaze of the vast unknown? This was the agonizing, heart-wrenching choice that faced Clara Solano, a soul stripped of her own light, living in the suffocating city of shadows. The name Clara now sounded like a macabre irony, for her life was drowning in a darkness that seemed to drain every ounce of her essence. She sought no spotlights, no dollar signs of an invented paradise. Her aspirations had withered, shrinking to a silent scream for survival. More than that, she wished with every fiber of her being that the first sound her child heard wouldn't be the crack of a life fading, but the gentle pulse of her own heart, or perhaps the distant whisper of the desert breeze. Clara dragged herself through the days in an oppressive cubicle in Vila Penumbra, where paper-thin walls bore silent witness to dramas unfolding in the dead of night. Her neighbors' muffled cries were a constant symphony, blending with the city's moans and the creak of rusty doors, a mournful melody of crushed lives, of broken dreams. The neighbors' tears were a daily mirror of the fragility that enveloped them, of the pain that seeped through the cracks and infiltrated every soul. Clara, in her own purgatory, felt empathy weigh heavy, but a chilling dread ran down her spine, an icy premonition that the abyss was drawing near. Pregnancy sharpened her senses, transforming every whisper into an imminent threat. But one night, the screams tore through the air. They weren't the familiar sobs. They were dry, desperate shrieks of pure terror that ripped through the night and clawed at Clara's soul. That primal, inhuman sound froze her to the bone. She curled up in bed, clutching her swollen belly as if to shield not only the baby, but herself from that audible horror. And then, silence. A void that seemed heavier than any scream, a suffocating blanket that crept into her room. A silence that cried out for a stolen life. Her neighbor Elena had been brutally silenced in front of her small child. Clara replayed the scene, the terror in the infant's eyes, the mother's despair. Elena's blood stained the hallway for days, a dark, viscous patch no one dared to clean, a macabre monument to indifference, to abandonment. No one cleaned it. No one questioned it. No one openly mourned, fearing they would be next. The absence of grief was a louder cry than any murder. It was irrefutable proof of the barbarity that had taken root there. It was in that stained hallway, under the weight of a complicit silence, that Clara knew she had to flee. There was no more room for hesitation. The life she carried within her was a sacred promise she had to keep, a silent vow to the future. 7 months pregnant, every kick from the baby was a clock ticking, a countdown to a new beginning. The baby's father, a man with an open smile and calloused hands, Lucas, had disappeared months earlier, swallowed by the border in search of a better future. She had no news, only the stubborn hope that he was alive, that he had made it, that he would be waiting for her. But that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She thought of waiting a little longer, perhaps until the baby was born, but then fear crushed her. The next day, reality hit her like a lightning bolt. At the bus stop, in the everyday bustle of the city, a low, urgent voice whispered in her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "They're asking about you. The same ones who took Elena." Clara froze. She hadn't seen anything, hadn't witnessed the crime. But it didn't matter. In that forgotten land, truth didn't need witnesses, only victims. The logic was cruel and undeniable. Those who kept silent could become targets. She was a weak link, a potential risk, even if innocent. Her silence, once a form of protection, was now her condemnation. With her heart pounding wildly and her breath caught in her throat, she ran back to her cubicle. In a few minutes, her hands trembled as she gathered essentials. A simple, worn change of clothes, an almost empty water bottle, a few rusty coins hidden in her bra, the little she had saved with so much sacrifice. And finally, a crumpled letter, the last trace of Lucas. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words he had written with such affection. "If I don't make it, promise you'll protect him. Our son is all we have." That phrase, a testament of love and responsibility, was the final push. That letter wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a cry, an order, an oath that had to be fulfilled. And that was enough to make her vanish into the night. The first border to be crossed wasn't physical nor geographical. It was fear. The fear of remaining in a place where life had no value, where justice was a delusion and silence the only currency. Leaving everything behind was a brutal decision, but staying meant certain death. On the way, she encountered other lost souls, each with their own story of terror and hopelessness. A 12-year-old boy, Miguel, with raw, bleeding feet, each step visible agony, but his eyes filled with cold resolve. An elderly woman, Donna Rosa, hunched not by age, but by the weight of grief and loss she carried on her back. A man, Ramiro, without legs, pushing his own wheelchair with superhuman strength, driven by the same primal need to survive. No one spoke much. Words were scarce, perhaps to conserve their little energy, perhaps not to expose the pain that gnawed at them. But all shared the same silence. The silence of those who flee because staying is a death sentence, an inevitable condemnation. It was a heavy silence, filled with understanding glances, gasping breaths, and the crunch of footsteps on dry earth. In the small border town, a temporary haven for those who risked it all, an older woman, with eyes that had seen too much, warned. Her voice hoarse and her gaze sharp. "Beware of the guides. Some don't cross. They sell." The phrase echoed in Clara's mind, a dark premonition of the dangers that still lurked. But Clara had already broken through the most impassable line, the one separating the paralysis of fear from the urgency of action. The inertia of terror had been shattered, replaced by the fierce need for survival. She stroked her belly, feeling the slight movement within, a living promise of the future. She whispered, her voice choked with emotion and determination. "Hold on, my love. Mommy will give you a life. No matter what hell I have to cross, I will give you a life." It was an oath to the wind, to the dust, to the desert that stretched endlessly before her. An oath that echoed in the deepest part of her soul, the force that propelled her into the unknown abyss. What about you? Have you ever felt like the whole world was turning against you, and the only way out was the path that terrified you the most? Leave your comment. Your journey, your struggle, also deserve to be unveiled. This story is an echo, a fiction born from real pain. We do not condone roots of despair. Our purpose is to illuminate, awaken consciousness, and build bridges of humanity. In the desert, there's no respite for skin battered by the merciless sun. No breeze to ease the suffocating heat that made the endless dunes dance in cruel mirages. Sometimes, there's also no hope. Just the golden vastness stretching to infinity. A carpet of sand and stones that seemed like a tomb. The air was so dry it rasped her throat with every breath, and the sun, an omnipresent, sadistic eye in the sky, burned her skin like a plague, sucking the last drop of life from her body. Clara had been walking for 3 days, and each step was a battle against exhaustion and thirst. The lukewarm water she'd bought at an exorbitant price, the result of brutal exploitation in a shadowy border market, tasted like poison, with no power to refresh. It was a murky, insipid liquid that barely went down her throat, but it was all that kept her on her feet. Her feet were numb, turned into dead flesh by burst blisters, and the sand that got into her shoes, grinding her skin to the bone. The soles of her feet burned like embers, but the physical pain was muffled by the urgency she felt from within. Her belly. Her belly. It moved, it spoke, it whispered with every gentle contraction, saying that life was still there, strong, and pulsating, irrefutable proof that hope had not completely died. There were 10 souls in their small group, moving through the darkness of the night, guided by a man with a monotone, emotionless voice. No questions. Don't look back. The darkness brought brief relief from the heat, but it also amplified the feeling of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of invisible shadows. The group's whispers were muffled by the crunch of feet on sand and the gasping sound of breath. On the first night, the journey had been bearable, despite the fatigue already setting in. There was a false hope that the worst was behind them. On the second night, the sun burned like a divine curse, turning the desert into an incandescent furnace. The temperature climbed to unbearable levels, and the landscape seemed to vibrate with the heat. The air grew denser, and the dust, stirred up by their dragging steps, clung to their sweaty skin. A man from the group, Enzo, vomited blood, a dark trickle that brutally contrasted with the pale sand, an alarming sign of exhaustion and imminent collapse. A mother, Isabella, fainted with her small daughter Sophia in her arms, her face pale and lips cracked, her fragile body yielding to the environment's cruelty. The image of the helpless child in her collapsed mother's arms squeezed Clara's heart, a dark premonition of what could happen to her and her baby. She felt contractions, gentle at first, but present, a warning from her body, a reminder of time running out. They're false, she tried to convince herself. He can't be born here. I won't let him. The phrase was a prayer, a defiance of fate, a desperate plea for time to stop. But the desert doesn't ask. The desert takes. The relentless nature cares nothing for human promises or pleas. On the third night, the unthinkable happened. The guide, the coyote, who had promised to lead them to freedom, vanished without warning, disappearing into the desert's darkness like a ghost. There was no goodbye, no explanation, just the sudden absence that left the group adrift, lost, and directionless. The group scattered in panic. Some ran in random directions, shouting names no one answered. Others wept in despair, their sobs cutting through the night's silence. Clara fell to her knees, not from exhaustion, but because, this time, the pain came like a knife, a violent, sharp tear that made her double over. These were no longer false contractions. It was the beginning. Labor. In the middle of nowhere, under a sky studded with indifferent stars, with the cold night sand seeping into her clothes and the biting loneliness of the desert as her only witness. She lay on a rough stone seeking a minimal support, her body trembling uncontrollably. She gasped, each exhalation a muffled moan, each inhalation a struggle. She cried in silence, tears mixing with the dust on her face, not from weakness, but from the immensity of the task before her. She felt herself tearing from within, a searing pain that consumed every fiber of her being. She bit her hand with such force to keep from screaming, to avoid attracting predators or bandits who might be lurking, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. She fought with her own body, with nature, with the cruel fate that had thrown her into that place. Every contraction was a whirlwind of pain and fear, but also an ancestral strength that emerged from within her, a strength she didn't know she possessed. And then, amidst the silent groans and excruciating pain, she heard it. A cry. Faint, almost inaudible, but undeniably alive. A sound that cut through the desert silence and pierced her soul. With hands stained with sand and blood, trembling, she groped in the dark, following the sound, until her fingers touched a small, wet body. She held the baby close to her chest, feeling the fragile warmth of that new life, an immediate and visceral connection. Her hands slippery but steady, she managed to tie the umbilical cord with a piece of ribbon she'd saved to tie her hair, a desperate act of improvisation that saved lives. She covered the small body with the only clean shirt she had, protecting him from the biting cold of the night and the swirling sand. Exhausted, the pain of childbirth still throbbing in her body, but her heart bursting with overwhelming love and relief, she collapsed. She slept right there for seconds that felt like centuries, a sleep of exhaustion and triumph. When she woke, the sun was already beginning to tint the horizon, and she felt fever consume her, an unbearable thirst burning her throat, the pain of a body ground down by superhuman effort. But the first thing she sought was the baby. He was still breathing, a miracle, a life that had defied the desert and won. What if it were you? Can you imagine giving birth alone, in the desert, with no one to hold your hand, just the sand and fear as witnesses? That's why we say again, if you're thinking of migrating, choose the paths of light, legal, humane. There are reliable teams that can guide you with dignity. And you, have you ever done something impossible just to keep someone alive? Share your battle in the comments. Your pain resonates here too. This work is a mirror, a fiction inspired by raw truths. We do not endorse illegal immigration. Our goal is to sow reflection, empathy, and point to safe routes. Clara was found 2 days after childbirth, on the brink of collapse. Fever consumed her, making her body burn and tremble, while thirst parched her from within, turning her throat into a personal desert. Postpartum pain was an excruciating torment, every movement and agony added to days without food or sleep. The baby, though, alive, was fragile, his cry a faint thread that seemed about to snap at any moment. She was on the edge of physical and mental abyss. But the image of Lucas, the crumpled letter, and the promise to protect that tiny being kept her alive by a thread of hope and pure stubbornness. With the last remnants of strength, she managed to lift a makeshift white cloth with one hand, a desperate sign of surrender and plea. In the other, she raised the baby, a gesture that cried out for mercy, for help, for salvation. She was no longer fleeing. She was asking for the only thing that mattered at that moment, a chance to survive, to offer a life to that newborn child. The answer came in the form of a gray vehicle that appeared out of nowhere on the arid horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust. It seemed like a mirage, but it was real. Uniformed men approached her, their expressions serious and impenetrable. They gave her water, which she drank desperately, feeling life slowly return to her veins. They offered a blanket, which enveloped her in a warmth she hadn't felt in days, a relief from the fever that consumed her. And above all, they gave her silence. A silence different from the oppressive silence of the desert, or the complicit silence of her homeland. It was a cold, impersonal silence that seemed to promise safety, but which, deep down, only masked the uncertainty of what was to come. The relief of being found was quickly replaced by a chilling apprehension. At the detention center, the facade of help crumbled. The first action was to strip her of everything. They took her silver medallion, a gift from her mother, a symbol of faith and protection that seemed insignificant to them. Her backpack, with the few precious changes of clothes and Lucas's letter, was confiscated. The few possessions she had left ripped from her hands. And then, the cruelest measure, the one that tore at her soul. They took her child. The baby, whom she had given birth to in the desert, alone, with her own hands, was taken Away from her. Standard procedure, they said. Words empty and emotionless, uttered by someone who saw no pain in her eyes, just another number on a form. She had no chance to ask for how long or why. She just watched, powerless, as her world collapsed again. She lay in a cold cell, the concrete walls bare and chilling, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and despair. She shared the space with other women, their faces marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. Some prayed softly, their lips moving in silent pleas. Others wept, their sobs muffled in thin blankets, their tears running down dirty cheeks. Clara, for her part, had no more tears. The pain was too deep to be expressed in crying. She merely clenched her fists, feeling her nails dig into her palms, a way to anchor herself in reality and not collapse. Her body still bled from the recent birth, a physical reminder of the violence she had endured and the life she had brought into the world. But her soul was already empty, like a hollow shell, drained of all emotion and hope. The separation from her child was a torture that surpassed any physical pain. After 3 long days, which felt like an eternity of anguish and uncertainty, they let her see the baby. The permission came with a strict rule, 10 minutes, not a second more. When she saw him, her heart broke. He was thin, his small bones seemed even more evident, and his eyes, once swollen from his birth cries, now looked dull and tired. But the most important sight, he was still breathing. That tiny breath of life was all she had. She held him with desperate tenderness, feeling the fragility of his tiny body. She whispered to him, a promise that echoed in her broken heart. "I'll get you out of here, I swear. No matter what I have to do, I'll get you out of here." Those words, spoken in an almost inaudible whisper, were her new purpose in life. The following days were a blur of despair and boredom. The routine at the detention center was monotonous and dehumanizing. The food was bland, the water rationed. Time dragged on, and every minute away from her son was torture. She observed the other women, each with her own story of flight and pain. Some had children who were also detained in other wings. Others had been separated from their husbands. There was a constant fear of being deported at any moment, of being sent back to the hell she had escaped, to certain death. Uncertainty was a silent torment that corroded everyone's minds. She was no longer Clara Solano. She was a number, a process, a line on a document that decided her fate. Human dignity was worthless in that place. She tried to stay strong, picturing her son's tiny face, the baby smell in her arms. That image was the only thread of sanity that held her. Each time, pain or despair threatened to overwhelm her. She clung to the promise that she would give her son a dignified life. The forced silence led her to an incessant internal dialogue. She revisited the days in the desert, the pain of childbirth, the loneliness of that moment of miracle and terror. She thought of Elena, of the bloodstain in the hallway, of the whisper that had made her flee. Everything blended into a haze of trauma, but at the center of it all was the tiny life she had brought into the world. This life was her responsibility, her motivation, her beacon amidst the darkness. The clock seemed stopped, and every minute without her son was a burden. Hope was a luxury she could barely afford, but she nurtured it in secret, hidden deep in her heart, like the last flame on a candle about to go out. Crossing the border is not the end. It's the beginning of another prison, that of forced silence that muzzles the voice, that of constant fear of being separated from loved ones, of being called a number and having one's identity stolen, of no longer knowing your name, of losing your essence. If you're also thinking of migrating, don't choose despair. Don't throw yourself into the hands of traffickers and the cruelties of the desert. Choose protection, legal guidance, dignity. There are trusted organizations that help people like you. You don't have to cross hell to change your life. There are safe, legal, and humane paths. Your life matters, and so do your children's. And you? What internal border are you still trying to cross? Share in the comments. Here, your silence is heard. This is a story of courage, a fiction inspired by real destinies. We do not promote dangerous routes. Our commitment is to the truth that liberates and the path that offers security. Clara was released 31 days later, not out of a sudden surge of compassion, not by an act of divine kindness, or by a sudden enlightenment of bureaucrats, but because someone in a distant system marked her as a non-priority case. A cold decision, devoid of any human pulse, that dictated the breath of lives with the click of a mouse. It was a formality, an administrative procedure that released her from physical shackles only to throw her into another form of limbo. She left with a crumpled paper in her hands, an official document that sealed her immediate fate, and a robotic voice that echoed in her mind. Appear for your hearing in 90 days. If you fail to appear, you will be deported. The threat of deportation hung over her like a Damocles sword, a constant reminder of the fragility of her new condition. In her arms, the baby, weaker, quieter, almost without the vitality she remembered, but alive. And that was all that mattered. That small breath of life, dependent on her, was her compass, her reason not to collapse. The first thing she felt upon stepping out of the detention center was the sun on her face, a warmth that didn't burn but nurtured her, and the fresh air, free of the smell of disinfectant and despair. She walked aimlessly for a few blocks, the paper in one hand and the baby in the other, until she spotted a small parish, a simple building, but one that emanated an aura of welcome. With her last vestiges of strength, she approached and knocked on the door. She found shelter there, in a modest space that became her temporary sanctuary. They offered her a borrowed bed, soft and clean, her first night of sleep without cold walls and the clang of bars. They gave her warm soup, simple food that warmed her from the inside out, restoring some of her vital energy. And most importantly, there, she breathed without fear for the first time. There were no judgmental glances, no veiled threats. This was a refuge where she could be Clara, and not just a number. Over time, the safety and calm of the parish began to heal the deeper wounds, those the desert and detention had left on her soul. She began to write in a small notebook. They were letters to herself, a way to process the trauma, to organize the turbulent thoughts that haunted her. She also wrote letters to her future son, telling him about the tortuous path she had walked, so he could have a chance. In one of these notes, her handwriting still a little shaky, but with her inner voice gaining strength, she wrote, "Now there's another border I need to cross, the one that separates me from my faith, from my strength, from my voice, and I will cross it." It was a declaration of war against apathy, against the despair that still tried to lodge itself in her heart. An internal, invisible border, but as real as any desert or wall. With each word, each reflection, she felt a piece of herself rebuilding. She began to talk to the people at the church, to hear their stories, to share her own. She discovered she wasn't alone on her journey. One day, encouraged by a church volunteer who noticed her determination, she knocked on the door of a legal aid group for immigrants, a small, discreet office, but one that exuded hope. She was listened to attentively. Her words were not just a tale of pain, but a story of resilience. She was advised about her rights, about the legal paths she could still pursue. She began the process with the help of lawyers and social workers who saw her as a human being, not a burden. Life is still a challenge, Clara knows that. The path is long, full of bureaucracy and uncertainty. But now, she has dignity. She has a process, a name. She is no longer an anonymous fugitive, but a woman fighting for her future and her sons within the rules. Now, she has a name. She is no longer just the non-priority case, but Clara Solano, a mother, a survivor, a woman with a story to tell. If you're also thinking of migrating, don't choose despair. Don't throw yourself into the hands of traffickers and the cruelties of the desert. Choose protection, legal guidance, dignity. There are trusted organizations that help people like you. You don't have to cross hell to change your life. There are safe, legal, and humane paths. Your life matters, and so do your children's and you. What internal border are you still trying to cross? Share in the comments. Here, your silence is heard.